DAF Peites Amid Aleph. Okay, the Mishnah. We're starting the new parak, the ninth parak of Eruvin Kol Gagos. A gag is a rooftop, as we know, and the rooftops in Eretz Yisrael and in Bavel were flat, and they were used for utility. You would go up there occasionally to use them. Sometimes they were used. The type of rooftops that the Mishnah is describing are there could be different types of rooftops. Some rooftops are used with regularity, and other kinds of rooftops, the standard rooftop is used without regularity, meaning that only on an occasional basis would a person go up to the roof. And in that respect, it's considered to be a different kind of rishus, a different kind of utility rishus from a chatzer. A chatzer is for regular habitation. You're in and out of there all the time. A gag is with less regularity. It's not the same kind of usage. And that's going to be relevant when discussing the different shittas in our Mishnah. Kol gagos ha'ir rishus echas. So the first opinion of the Mishnah is that every single rooftop is considered to be contiguous as far as domains are concerned, which means you can carry from one gag to another gag, and we're talking about items that are at the inception of Shabbos on the roof. We're not talking about carrying items from your house to the roof. We're talking about moving items from one rooftop to another. That's perfectly fine. Uvilvad shelo yehiga gavoa yud onamach yud divrei Reb Meir. Provided that one rooftop is not 10 tfachim higher than another. If it is, then that demarcates some kind of segregation which would preclude me from moving an item from one to the other. This is the opinion of Reb Meir. Why that should be, the Gemara will explain shortly. The Chachamim disagree, and they say just like there are separate residents in each structure, so too the rooftops of each structure are considered to be separate domains. And just like you can't carry from one chutzner to another without creating an eruv, so too you can't carry from one gag to another gag without creating an eruv between the two gagos. So that's the opinion of the Chachamim. Rabbi Shimon,
whether there's no, it doesn't matter how they're even very close.
Even if they're especially if they're very close. But if there's no eruv made, according to the issue is the eruv. The Chachamim say the fact that there's no eruv, just like you can't carry from one chutzner to another without an eruv, because you have to incorporate it in order to carry. So too you'd have to incorporate the rooftops in order to carry. Rabbi Shimon Omer, echad gagos ve'echad chatzeros ve'echad karfefos, rishus echas hein lekelim sheshavsu l'sochan velo lekelim sheshavsu b'soch habayis. Reb Shimon is the most liberal opinion. He agrees with Reb Meir that you're allowed to carry from one gag to another, but he goes even one step further. And he says you can even carry from a gag to a chutzner, from a chutzner to a gag, and from those two domains to a karfeif, which is actually a private enclosed lot, which is also a different utility from a chutzner. Whereas a chutzner's utility is for multiple residents, a karfeif is usually singularly owned, but yet it's not a house, it's an enclosure. And so Reb Shimon says that any kind of domain which is out in the open, which is not a private home, you can carry from one to the other. They all are classified under Carmelis. But at the same time, he says that's only for kalim that were in these respective domains. You can never carry from a rishus hayachid mamish, like a house, out into a chatzer that is where there was no eruv made, nor can you transfer from a house to someone else's chutzner. But according to Reb Shimon, you can always transfer objects from one chutzner to another, from a chutzner to another kind of open domain like that, even though their utilities are different. This is where Reb Shimon and Reb Meir disagree. Reb Meir says that you can only transfer from one domain to another, provided that the utilities are the same. And Reb Shimon says even if the utilities are different, you can transfer from one to the other. And the only time, therefore, that Reb Shimon requires an eruv is only to be able to transfer from a rishus hayachid to a chutzner. But to transfer from one chutzner to another is perfectly fine. I have a feeling your question will be answered if you let us go a few lines in the Gemara. So if at the end then you have a question, we'll go on. Okay, so there's a lot of vagary here, which we're going to try and vagueness, which we'll try and clarify. So Yosef, let's take a look at the Gemara. Yosef Abaya bar Abin v'Rabbi Chanina bar Abin. So these two students were sitting in front of their Rebbe Abaya. V'Yosef Abaya Gabayu v'Yasvi Ka'amri Bishlama Rabbanon Savri. So it works out well according to the Chachamim. Remember, the Chachamim are the ones who say that just like the inside of a structure is privately owned and you cannot carry from one structure to another, so too you cannot carry from one gag to another. So they hold Savri Kishem Shediyurin Chalukin Lamata Kachdiyun Chalukin Lamayla. That just like the residents are disparate below, inside the structures, inside the buildings, so too on the rooftops there are disparate owners, and therefore you cannot carry from one to the other. Ela Rabbi Meir, my kasavar. But what does Rabbi Meir hold? I kasavar kashem shedirin chalukin lamata kachdiyun chalukin lamayla. If he holds that just like there are disparate owners below, so too above. So my rishus echasein. Then why would you say that you're allowed to carry from one to the other, and they're considered to be one domain from one rooftop to the other? Vi kasavar ein chalukin. And if you're going to tell me that they're not disparate, the two rooftops, and therefore because their utilities are the same, you can always carry from one rooftop to the other. So then the question is, because anything, since they're both above 10 tfachim, they're considered to be a unified domain, so then afilu gag gavoa asar v'namach yud nami. Then why does he create this qualification that if one rooftop is 10 tfachim higher than the other, then you cannot transfer from one to the other? What difference should that make if they're all considered to be one domain? So Amar Lahu Abaya lo Shamiya Lahu Hada Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, that you must not have heard of the statement of Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, or sort of rhetorically, haven't you heard what Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi said, that Omer Haya Rabbi Meir Kol Makam Shatamotze Shtei Rishuyos Vehein Rishus Echas Kigon Amud B'Rishus Hayachid Gavoa Asara V'Rachav Dalid Asur L'Kasef Alav. That Rav Meir was quoted as saying that any time you have two surfaces that are in the same, that are halachically qualify as the same domain, but because of their vertical distance from each other, they are considered to be two separate surfaces. And the example that he gives is that let's say I'm in an area that's a Rishus HaYachid, complete Rishus HaYachid, and there's a pillar within that domain that is 4 by 4 tfachim and 10 tfachim high. Now, we know that a pillar that is 4 by 4 tfachim and 10 tfachim high also qualifies as a Rishus HaYachid. So I have a Rishus HaYachid inside a Rishus HaYachid. Rabbi Meir said that you're not allowed to take off your jacket and hang it on that pillar, even though you're not doing anything. You're not transferring from one domain to another because they're both Rishus HaYachids. Why then is it usher to do that? Because Gezerah Mishum Teil B'Rishus HaRabim. Because he said if we allow you to do that, then you may be tempted to do that when you encounter a mound of earth in a Rishus HaRabim that also has the din of a Rishus HaYachid, because the mound of earth might be 4 by 4 tfachim and 10 tfachim high, and because you're used to hanging up your jacket on pillars, you may be tempted to hang your jacket on a mound of earth in Rishus HaRabim. So basically, Reb Meir says the rabbis made a blanket rule that you can never transfer from one domain to another, even if halachically they qualify as the same domain. And therefore, hachanami gzera mishum teil b'rishus harabim. And that's the reason why Reb Meir says that you cannot transfer from one rooftop to another if one is higher than the other 10 tfachim. Technically, you're right. There's nothing wrong with it. They all can qualify as the same domain. The reason why you can't do it is because you may come to, next time, transfer from a rishus harabim to a rishus hayachid. So savar mina afilu machteshes v'afilu gigis. When the students heard this concern of Reb Meir and the decree that he felt needed to be made, someone please open Benny's Gemara. So when the rabbis heard this, they thought that Rabbi Meir was so machmir that this halacha was true, that you could not take an object in Rishus HaYachid and place it upon even a movable surface that is higher than 10 tfachim, such as a mortar or a large bucket or something like that. They thought that Rabbi Meir was so machmir that even movable objects within a Rishus HaYachid that are considered to be a disparate surface, you would not be able to put things on that. So Amar Lahu Abaye, but Abaye said to them, no, that's not true, because Achi Omar Marlo, Amar Reb Meir, Ela Amud, Va'amas Harechayim, Hol, Va'adam Kavei Alehem Makom, Hol, Va'adam Kavei Alehem Makom. He said, no, Rabbi Meir was only machmir with an immovable surface, such as a pillar, or such as a millstone, which is affixed to the ground. The reason why Rabbi Meir is machmir over there is because a person designates permanence to those surfaces, just like a mound of earth in Rishus HaRabim is a permanent surface. But if something is a non-permanent surface because it's movable, it's a utensil, there Reb Meir never prohibited you to put items on it, even if it does qualify in size as its own separate rishus. So now the Gemara says, "V'harei kosel shebein beis chatzeros dekavua, v'amar Rav Yehuda kishetim silomer l'divrei Reb Meir gagin rishus la'atzman, chatzeros rishus la'atzman, karfeifos rishus la'atzman." So the question that the Gemara is asking is as follows. We know that basically Rav Yehuda wanted to clarify Rav Meir's shita. Don't think, says Rav Yehuda, that Rav Meir only permits you to transfer from one gag to another. He also permits you to transfer from one chutzner to another without making an eruv, and he also permits you to transfer from one karfeif to another without making an eruv. The only thing that Rav Meir does not allow, which Rav Shimon of the Mishnah does allow, is to transfer from a gag to a chutzner, or from a chutzner to a karfeif, or from a chutzner to a gag, etc. Because the utilities of these open spaces are different, that's where Rav Meir says you can't transfer from one to the other. But when the utilities are the same, then even without an eruv, you are allowed to transfer kalim from one domain to another, as long as they were in the chutzner bein hashmashas. So what do you see from here? You see from here that Rav Meir is not just talking about gagim, he's talking about chutzers, he's talking about karfeifs too. Now let's think about it for a second. What normally divides one gag from another? A big wall normally divides one chutzner from another, and yet Reb Meir says you're allowed to transfer from one chutzner to another. So my lav d'shori l'tiltulei derech kosa. So you see that what does Reb Meir permit? How are you going to get a tricycle that's been in my backyard to my neighbor's backyard? How are you going to do that on Shabbos if there's a big wall dividing? You're going to have to put the tricycle up on the wall and then pull it off on the other side off of the wall. Now if you're going to do that, then what do you see? That Reb Meir is permitting you to put an object from a lower surface to a higher surface, which we just said that Reb Meir prohibits. So how can that be? That's the Gemara's question. How can it be that you're telling me that according to Reb Meir, you're never allowed to transfer from a lower surface to a higher surface that's divided by 10 tefachim? If you see that Reb Meir would permit you to transfer from one chutzner to another, you're invariably going to be lifting it up, putting it on a higher surface temporarily, and then transferring it downwards. So the Gemara says, "My lav d'shoi l'tiltulei derech kosel." It must be that she's allowing you to do it, as I just described. So Amar Rav Huna bar Yehuda Amar Rav Sheshus lo lahachnis ulahotzi derech pisachim. No, that's not what Rav Meir is permitting. Rav Meir would only permit you to transfer the tricycle from my backyard to my friend's backyard, provided that there's a wall or a window. Not a wall, a window or a doorway. That would not necessitate you lifting it up higher than 10 tefachim. But if you have to lift it higher than 10 tefachim, it wouldn't be okay. Yeah.
It would also be okay if the wall wasn't dalad al dalad, right? Then it's not just a yachid, then it's a makom petur.
Then it would be a makom petur. But it's not clear that Reb Meir still might hold of this isser, even with the makom petur. It's not clear. If Reb Meir even asers from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaYachid, he might also aser that as well, although maybe not. Maybe you could argue that since it doesn't have the necessary dimensions of 4 tefachim, then he doesn't have, it's not comparable to a tail. It's not comparable to a mound of earth anymore. Could be what you're saying is correct. Yes.
I mean, now we're dealing with gagging, but suddenly...
Tosos points that out? Okay, good.
We're dealing with gagging, but we finished out dealing with chatzeros. This never came up, really, from Rabbi Meir's opinion.
Right.
It's unusual to now that they're sticking this whole new concept.
Well, you have to realize that all along we've not been going like Reb Meir. All along we've been going like the Chachamim, who say that if you want to move objects from one chutzner to another, you have to incorporate both chutzers.
You think that they would have brought in Reb Meir's...
Reb Meir was mentioned incidentally a long time ago, but we didn't really register it in our memories so well. So where did you say this? My lav. Exactly as Mr. Blinik has just suggested. Correct. Very good. That's that one-line Tosfos over there. Okay. V'chachamim omrim kol echad shkoyach Harold. V'chachamim omrim kol echad ve'echad rishus b'fnei atzmo. And the Chachamim disagree, and they say that each rooftop is its own separate domain, and therefore you cannot transfer items from one rooftop to the other. So Itmar, Rav Omar, Ein Metaltalin Bo, Ela B'Dalet Amos. Rav now wants to clarify the Chachamim's opinion, and he says that not only are you not allowed to transfer items from one gag to another, but you're not even allowed to carry items on one rooftop more than Daled Amos, because he says that it's got a dim of like a Carmelis, and therefore you can't carry more than Daled Amos, just like in any other Carmelis you can't carry more than Daled Amos. Now why that is, you'll see in just a moment. Ushmuel Amar Mutter Lataltel Bekulo. And Shmuel says, no, not at all. You're allowed to carry through and through. It's a regular private domain that's enclosed, and therefore you're allowed to carry completely. So the question is, what is the machlokes here? So the Gemara explains, when the walls of the building that are beneath the roof are clearly discernible from the rooftop itself, everyone agrees that we say the principle of good asik mechitzta. What does the term good asik mean? You imagine that the wall that begins from the ground up continues going ad hashamayim, continues going ad infinitum upwards. And therefore, this is considered to be, both according to Rav and Shmuel, an enclosed Rishus HaYachid, in which case you'd be allowed to carry in it. Right? So therefore, even Rav would agree that when the walls of the building are discernible while you're standing on the rooftop, then of course you're allowed to carry throughout the rooftop more than Daled Amos. Okay? And also, Kipligi b'mechitzo she'eino nikar. So what's the machlokas? The machlokas between Rav and Shmuel is when the walls of the structure are not discernible when you're standing on the rooftop. Now, this, says Rashi, could occur in one of two ways. It could occur if, let's say you have a building that its roof is wider than the structure itself. I'm trying to think of a building.
We have our roofs overhang it a little bit.
Where you have an overhang.
Yeah.
Where you have an overhang,
Yeah.
right? And as a matter of fact, there is I think there's a Tosfos here that discusses that idea that our rooftops, at least in medieval Europe, the roofs do overhang, so that if you're standing on the roof, you can't clearly see the walls of the house, right? Because you have an overhang. The roof juts out further than the walls. That's one way that you could that could happen. Another way that could happen is if you have two buildings that are adjacent to each other, and the roofs are connected, so that the person who did the tarring of the roof tarred over both buildings together, and now it's completely open to the other roof. So while you could see three sides of the building from the rooftop, the fourth side is completely open, at least from the perception of the person that's standing on the roof. He can't see that fourth wall at all that divides between the two structures. So therefore, that's where there's a machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. That what? 1 second. So that what is the machlokas? Rav Amar ein mitaltalin bo ela b'daled amos. Rav says you can only carry 4 amos in your own gag, because lo amrinan good asik mechitzta, because in that situation where you can't see the wall coming up, then you don't say that the wall is halachically going up. Ushmuel Amar muter letalta bekulo darminan good asik mechitzta. And Shmuel says even when you can't actually see the wall, but you know the wall is there beneath you, you still say good asik, and you imagine the wall going all the way up. Yes, Bob?
Isn't there a din to put fences around?
Yes, the Gemara, interestingly enough, does not reckon with this issue, although many of the Meforshim, I believe, discuss it over here. The reason why I mentioned that a rooftop does not have regular utility is because the halachas of creating a ma'akeh, a parapet around your roof, are different from the laws of Eruvin. The only time that you're required to create a parapet around your roof is if there's a regularity of use. If you only go up occasionally to the rooftop, let's say to fix the roof, or to spread out something, then you're not required to put up a parapet. Okay? So now, Tanan. The Mishnah now says, V'chachamim omrim, and by the way, a parapet, there's also the possibility, though I have to think it through more carefully, there's also a possibility that a parapet that the Torah requires can be made in such a way where it doesn't qualify as a halachic mechitza for the purposes of Eruvin.
It's not high enough.
I'm not sure about the height, but it could be that you could create spacing between the slats such that it wouldn't qualify halachically as a. I'm not sure about that, but
these walls you're saying are the walls of the building or separate walls that divide the property lines?
It's the walls of the building
Of the
itself.
building.
You could have, let's say, two townhouses that are mamish smack against each other, but you have a dividing wall. Right. So, but you just can't see it. You can't see it when you're looking from the top because the roof is covered. So now the Gemara says, Tanan v'chachamim omrim kol echad ve'echad rishus la'atzma. Now let's take a look at our Mishnah and see if Rav and Shmuel will work into our Mishnah. The Mishnah says that according to the Chachamim, each rooftop is its own separate domain. So Bishlam l'Shmuel nicha, that language works out well according to Shmuel, because when you say that something is its separate domain, that implies that you can carry in it. But Elo l'Rav kasha. But according to Rav, what's the point of saying that it's its own domain? If it's its own domain, doesn't that imply that you can carry throughout the domain? So the Gemara says, no, Amri Bei Rav Mishmei de Rav Shelo Yitaltel Beis Amos Begagzeh U Beis Amos Begagzeh. No, the only point of saying that it's its own separate domain is to tell me that I cannot transfer items from one rooftop to the other, even if the transferal is less than 4 amos. Meaning that even if I want to just move something slightly from one rooftop to the other, that's what the Mishnah is saying according to Rav is Aser, and that's because each rooftop is disparate from the other. And that does not comment, however, on whether I'm allowed to carry throughout the rooftop more than Dalet Amos. That's the way Rav will understand the Mishnah. Frek the Gemara v'ha'amar Rebbe Lazar. But listen to the following statement of Rebbe Lazar. Ki havinan beBavel. When I was in Bavel, Hava Amri, and Rebbe Lazar lives in Eretz Yisrael, but he visited Bavel. So Hava Amrinon Beirav Mishmei Derav Amri, that people were saying that in the base medrash of Rav, in his yeshiva, in the name of Rav, they say that ein metal bo ela b'dalet amos, that you're only allowed to carry less than dalet amos on one rooftop, and v'hani devei Shmuel tanu. But then, in the base medrash of Shmuel, they brought a brisa to contradict Rav, because the brisa that they brought says, Ein lahen ela gagan, that according to the Chachamim, the resident of a particular structure is only allowed to use his own roof, but he cannot use the roof of his neighbor. So that brisa seems to imply that you can use your own roof with unlimited use. My ein lahem elagagan lav d'shari l'tiltulei b'kulei, and that implies that you can carry throughout it without being limited by only less than dalet amos. So and that's a kash on Rav. So the Gemara, but wait a minute. Umi alima mimas nisin dukimna shali yitaltu shtei amos begagzeh hachanami beis amos begagzeh u beis amos begagzeh. So the Gemara says, I can give you the same answer that I gave to explain Rav in our Mishnah. That just like in our Mishnah, we explained that when it says that each neighbor has his own rooftop, it doesn't mean that you have your own rooftop, that it's its own rishus that you can carry more than dalet amos. It just means that it's a separate rishus vis-a-vis another roof that you may not transfer even less than dalet amos from one rooftop to another. That's what the brisa means as well. When it says all you have is your own rooftop, it means that you can't even transfer less than dalet amos from one rooftop to another. Fine. Amar Rav Yosef lo shamia li hashmaita. Rav Yosef now, after hearing the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel, says, I never heard this shita of Shmuel, who says that even when the walls of the structure are not visible from the rooftop, we still say gud asik mechitzta. I never heard that anyone even suggest that you could be so liberal. So Amar le Abaya atamart nihalan, that Abaya says, Rebbe, I'm sorry, but you're suffering from amnesia again. As we've seen, Rav Yosef had this condition. And so first of all, you actually told us this halacha. Ve'aha amart nihalan, gag gadol hasamuch lekatan, hagadol muter ve'hakatan asur. That you had told us the following halacha. You have two structures which are adjacent to each other. One structure is much wider than the other. So from a view from the helicopter, it would look like the letter T. You have one building which is much wider than the other. And if you remember, we had the same configuration much earlier in Eruvin, when we were talking about two chatzers, which are in this configuration as well, that are enclosed. And we had said that the larger chatzer, the wider chatzer, is allowed to carry within itself completely, with complete impunity, because it's considered to be enclosed on all four sides. The fact that it opens up into a smaller chatzer, we view that opening as just a doorway. And just because a wall has a doorway does not mean that it's not a wall. However, the small chatzer, because one side of that chutzner is completely open into the larger chutzner, it's not considered enclosed on all four sides, and therefore, because it has a separate rishus, a separately owned rishus encroaching on its domain, it cannot carry within that chutzner unless it makes an eruv with the larger chutzner. So that's the general halacha, and the same thing, Abaye says, Rav Yosef, you taught us the same principle when it comes to a rooftop, and you told us that if you have these two rooftops that are configured in that way, the larger rooftop can carry completely, like Shmuel had said, and the smaller rooftop cannot carry at all. And presumably the issue again here, the Abaye is assuming, is that we're dealing with two rooftops where there's no visibility of the dividing roof, right? So, and because ve'amar tzlan Allah, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel lo shanu ela sheyesh diurin al zeh v'diurin al zeh dahavi laha dekatan mechitza nidrases. That you had taught us the following halacha. You had taught us that even though you cannot see the wall that divides between the two structures from the rooftop, because from the rooftop it looks like one contiguous letter T, but nevertheless you had told us that the only reason why the smaller chutzner is not allowed to carry by itself is only because there's constant foot traffic going back and forth from the large chutzner to the small chutzner and vice versa. However, if there is not constant foot traffic, and normally the people of the large chutzner keep to themselves and the people of the small chutzner keep to themselves, then it would be permitted for the people of the small chutzner to carry in the small chutzner, even though one side of their domain is completely open into the larger rooftop. Why is that? So Abaye says, you clearly hold that even though you cannot see the wall that's coming up from the ground, you still say good asik mechitzta. You still say that you imagine that wall going up. So you see that you yourself, Rav Yosef, subscribe to Shmuel Shita. So Amar Lei Ana Hachi Amri Lechu. So Rav Yosef said, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I know for sure that I don't hold to that. So I must have told you as follows. I must have told you, Lo shanu ela sheyesh mechitza al zeh umechitza al zeh de gadol mishterei begifufe v'kata nifratz b'miluo. I was talking about a case where you're dealing with rooftops that have walls, not with rooftops that don't have walls. And on that I commented that if both the large rooftop and the small rooftop have walls completely surrounding them, then the large rooftop can carry because they have four walls, and the small rooftop cannot carry because it's like that chutzner that opens up completely on one side to a larger chutzner. Aval ein mechitza lo al zeh v'lo al zeh shneim asurin. But if neither of them have walls, then both of them would be considered to be usur, would be considered usur to carry. And the reason is, says Rav Yosef, because I hold like Rav, I hold that when you cannot discern the walls when you're standing on the rooftop, then it's considered not having walls and you're not allowed to carry. V'ha diurin amartlan. So Abaye asked them the question, but wait a minute, didn't you tell us this distinction between whether there's foot traffic or no foot traffic? So what is that supposed to mean? So that's why Abaye says, I thought that's what you meant. So Rav Yosef says, if I ever said anything about there being foot traffic, what I meant to say was as follows. Lo shanu ela sheyesh mechitza re'uya ledira al zeh u'mechitza re'uya ledira al zeh de gadol mishteri begifufe v'kata nifritz b'miluo. Aval yesh mechitza re'uya ledira al hagadol ve'ein re'uya ledira al hakatan afilu katan shari livnei gadol. So Rav Yosef says, you know what, I probably, when I talked about diurin, which means for habitation, I wasn't talking about people having foot traffic crossing constantly between the large rooftop and the small rooftop. What I was saying was as follows. You have two rooftops that are completely enclosed with actual walls above the roof. And what I meant to say was as follows. If both rooftops have sound and sturdy walls that are meant for people to go up there with regularity, so then the large chutzner can carry within the large chutzner, and the small chutzner can carry within the people of the small chutzner can carry within the small chutzner. I mean the small gag is what I mean to say. However, let's say the walls of the large rooftop are sturdy and permanent, and the walls of the small chutzner are dilapidated and very unsound. So in that situation, because the residents of the small gag have not duly constituted the walls of their rooftop, we assume that they are abdicating their rights to access on their rooftop, and thus the people of the large chutzner are allowed to carry not only in their chutzner, but they're allowed to carry in the small chutzner as well. And let's explain this. My taima, what's the reason? Kevan de lo avid mechitza sluke sliku nafshayu mehacha. Because they did not build a sturdy wall around it to show that they wish to use it with regularity, they have demonstrated abdication of the utility of their rooftop. And where do you see this? Kaha da Amar Rav Nachman, asa sulam kavua legago huter b'chol hagagin kulan. Here's the precedent. We have a halacha from Rav Nachman, which is as follows: if you have a series of rooftops, even though according to the Chachamim, you're not allowed to carry from one rooftop to the other, because they're all separately owned, nevertheless, if one neighbor builds and affixes a ladder from his porch to the rooftop to show that he wishes to use the rooftop, then, and no other neighbor does that, so there's a demonstration here that he's the sole purveyor of all of the rooftops. The fact that he's built a ladder demonstrates that he's the only person who plans to actually use the rooftops. And as such, we consider all the rooftops being abdicated by the other neighbors and saying, yeah, go ahead, use our rooftop, it's yours. Because if we were really interested in being stakeholders on our own rooftops, then we would have also put ladders up. But the fact that he's the only guy who puts a ladder up demonstrates that he's the sole purveyor of all the rooftops. Now, in the same vein, says the Gemara, the same halacha would apply to over here. If the people of the large chutzner are the only ones who care about the utility of the rooftop because they build a sturdy, permanent kind of wall, and the people of the small rooftop have a dilapidated, about to collapse wall, it may qualify as an enclosure to allow you to carry, but it doesn't qualify as an enclosure to stake a claim of ownership of that rooftop. And therefore, the people of the large chutzner are the only stakeholders of both rooftops, and therefore they can carry, but not only in their rooftop, but they can carry in the other rooftop as well. So the Gemara now says, Amar Abaye. Abaye says, Bana aliyah al gabe beso. Abaye says in a similar vein, if a person builds an actual structure, an actual enclosed structure on top of his roof, and none of the other homeowners in the area have built structures on top of their rooftops, the asa lefaneha daka arba'a, and he also, within that structure, he creates a little doorway that opens up to the other rooftops, hutar b'chol hagagin kulan. In the same vein of the person who builds a ladder, this guy who has shown that he plans to be a roof dweller, is basically now has free reign of all of the rooftops that connect to his rooftop, because he's demonstrated that he plans more than any other neighbor to be the sole purveyor of all of the rooftops. Amar Rava, so Rava qualifies that statement and he says, Pa'amim shahadaka li'isr. But there will be times that creating a small doorway in a roof structure can actually preclude you from using the other rooftops. Heichi dami, what would be the case? The avida lahadi tarbitza de beise. In a case where instead of constructing that little opening, that little doorway, opening up to the other rooftops, he instead creates that little doorway to open up to a garden that is in his backyard. When he does that, then he's demonstrated the amar l'neture tarbitza hu da avida, because that demonstrates that the purpose of this roof structure is not to be able to be a roof dweller per se, but is rather to be a guardian, to have a watchtower where he can look over his field that's growing and the garden that's growing in his backyard, and therefore the little doorway that he creates and the structure that he creates is actually a segregating structure to preclude him from carrying to the other rooftops instead of allowing him to carry on the other rooftops. Yes, questions?
I was just thinking that there's a difference between the case of the ladder and the case with the walls, because with the ladder, the guy's showing that he wants to use their property.
But the ladder only goes up to his roof.
Oh, fine.
Yeah.
So, how could Rabbi Yosef say that in the case where they had walls built, because it was there was an opening where the T meets, the small Gog meets the big Gog.
Right.
So there's an opening there. If it's more than 10 amos, then
So we're talking about where it's less than 10 amos. Remember we had this whole discussion, or much earlier in Eruvin, when we had the T structure by Chatzeros as well, if you recall.
Right.
Yeah.
So it has to be less than.
It has to be less than 10 amos. Yeah.
When you say that the door opens into the garden, you just mean that he can. It's the garden's down below.
Yeah, he'd have to.
He'd have to
Obviously,
get a ladder.
he needs to put a ladder there, or he needs to, or maybe it's only there for observation. It's like an observation deck. But the point is that he hasn't built the door opening up to the other Gagim.